The wind over the plains whispered of coming rain, stirring the brittle grass and the dust along the creek bed. It was the third summer since Helen Ayers had buried her husband and taken to living alone on the edge of what some folks still called the frontier. Her cabin was simple. Rough logs, one window facing the east, a porch that groaned when the wind changed, but it was hers. And in a world that had taken more than it had given, that meant something. That morning, Helen had gone down to the river early, basket in hand, hoping to gather fresh herbs before the clouds rolled in. She was halfway down the slope when she saw the blood, just a few drops at first, dotting the dry rocks like red seeds. Then more, smeared across the earth, leading into a thick patch of brush near the willows. She stopped. Every instinct told her to turn back, but another part, older, deeper, urged her forward. She moved slowly, pulling back the branches, and there, crumpled beneath the leaves, was a boy, no older than 10. Bare chest streaked with mud and sweat, long dark hair tangled with twigs. His right shoulder was torn open by something sharp. An animal? A trap? It was hard to tell, but the wound was raw, angry, and bleeding. His eyes snapped open as she approached, wide and wild with fear. Helen lifted both hands, palms open. "Easy," she whispered. "I'm not going to hurt you." He didn't understand the words. She could see it in his eyes. But her tone, her stillness, kept him from running. She knelt slowly and reached into her basket for her canteen. "Water," she said, and took a sip herself before offering it. The boy hesitated. Then, trembling, he reached for it. It took all of Helen's strength to carry him back to the cabin. He was light, too light, but the dead weight of his pain and fear made every step heavier. She laid him gently on the cot in the corner, lit the fire, and began to boil water. He watched her the whole time. Not a word, not a sound, but his eyes followed her every move. She cleaned the wound with care, gritting her teeth when he whimpered. She wrapped it tight, ground herbs into a poultice, and murmured comfort he couldn't understand. When she touched his hand, he flinched, but he didn't pull away. That night the rain came hard, drumming on the roof like hoofbeats. The boy slept fitfully, the fever rising fast. Helen sat beside him with a damp cloth, brushing his forehead, whispering fragments of lullabies she barely remembered. "Who left you out there?" she asked the silence. "Who's looking for you?" But the storm had no answers. Just before dawn, the boy opened his eyes and said one word, low and trembling. "Tovi." Helen didn't understand it. Not yet, but she would, because 3 days later, at the edge of the prairie, 50 warriors appeared beneath the rising sun, silent, proud, and armed, led by a man with fire in his eyes, and the same face as the boy in her bed. The rising sun bathed the prairie in gold, but Helen felt no warmth. She stood on her porch barefoot, her heart beating louder than the cicadas in the trees. Out beyond the ridge they came, silent, mounted, and resolute. 50 warriors, feathers, leather, bows slung across their backs, spears held upright like tall, unmoving trees. Their faces were painted in earthen reds and dark charcoal lines. They did not shout or gallop wildly. They approached slowly, deliberately. Helen didn't run. She didn't cry. She stepped down from her porch and waited, the boy asleep inside, fever breaking just hours ago. They stopped about 30 yards away. One man dismounted, taller than the others, bare-chested, with a necklace of bones resting over powerful shoulders. His expression unreadable, neither rage nor kindness, only calm. His eyes locked with hers. He took one step forward, then another, and when he was 10 feet away, he finally spoke. One word. "Where?" Helen hesitated. "Inside, he's alive." The man studied her, his gaze searching her for something. Then slowly he passed her and entered the cabin without a sound. Helen followed. The boy lay curled in blankets, his skin damp with sweat, but no longer burning. When he saw the man, his lips parted. "Tovi." The man knelt beside the cot, his large hand brushing the boy's hair with such gentleness it made Helen ache. He spoke in a language she didn't understand, but the tone was clear. Relief, affection, and something deeper. Love. "Tovi," he repeated. Then he turned toward Helen. "You helped him." It wasn't a question, just a truth, spoken low. She nodded. He was bleeding, fevered, alone. He stood. "You gave medicine, shelter." "I did what anyone should do," she said quietly. He looked at her for a long moment. Not everyone would have. The warriors did not come to burn or threaten. They came to retrieve a son. Lost, now found. But as the morning unfolded, they stayed. Tovey, whose name she learned meant spring flower, refused to leave Helen's side. The boy had clung to her during the nights, through his pain. He had woken calling for her. Now he reached for her hand even with his father nearby. Helen stepped aside to give them space, but the man, his name she learned later was Nawakai, watched her with cautious interest. Every time she bent to check the boy's bandage or stirred the soup, his eyes followed, not in judgment, in something else. That evening, as the sun sank and the warriors set camp just beyond the tree line, Nawakai approached the porch where Helen sat mending a torn sleeve. "You live alone," he said. "I do. No husband, no child. Not anymore." He didn't reply right away. Then he sat on the porch rail, his voice lower now. "Tovey's mother died in winter, fever." Helen's sewing slowed. "I'm sorry. He ran chasing a fox, got lost, found a trap." She looked at him. "He's lucky you found him in time." Nawakai's eyes narrowed gently. "You found him in time." And for the first time that day, silence settled between them without tension. Just understanding. The Comanche man and the frontier widow, two parents shaped by loss. Two strangers bound by a child neither expected. And something told Helen this wasn't the end of their story. It was only the second sunrise. The Comanche camp stayed just beyond the tree line for 2 more days. Not out of necessity. They had horses, food, and warriors strong enough to travel, but because Tovey refused to leave. Each morning, Helen awoke to find him already sitting by the window, eyes waiting for her. And each evening, Nawakai came to the porch, watching the two of them through the soft twilight, speaking few words but never turning away. The other warriors seemed to understand, or perhaps they simply followed their leader's quiet lead. No one pushed, no one questioned, and still, not a word was exchanged between Tovey and Helen that either could fully understand. But the boy smiled now. He helped her stir the soup. He brought her a small carved feather. His, he tried to explain with gestures, and tucked it into her apron pocket. She began learning simple Comanche phrases from him. He repeated her English words with careful precision. They built something with no dictionary and no demand, only patience and kindness. One morning, Helen stepped out to find Nawakai already sitting near her garden, sharpening a bone-handled knife on a smooth stone. "You wake early," she said. He didn't look up. "The earth rises early, so must I." She crouched beside a patch of young lettuce, brushing dirt from her hands. "You plan to leave soon?" "I should." She nodded. "But—" He paused, the stone still against the blade. "But the boy, he dreams of you." Helen felt her breath catch. "He speaks your name in his sleep," Nawakai added. "He eats more now, smiles. It has been a long time since I've seen that." Helen looked away, eyes on the tilled rows of earth. "I didn't mean to take his heart, only to keep it beating." Nawakai turned his head slightly, regarding her. "He lost one mother, found another." She swallowed hard. "And I," he added, voice low, "did not expect to find a woman with such quiet fire." Later that day, a soft knock came at her door. It was Tovey, holding a small wooden carving, a bird in flight. He held it out to her, solemn as a gift meant for kings. She knelt and touched his cheek. "What's this?" He placed a hand on his chest. "Tovey," he said, then pointed to the bird. "Helen." She smiled. "Is that what I am to you? A bird?" He nodded seriously. "Bird fly, bird stay, bird no leave." She pulled him close, tears stinging at the edges of her eyes. From the trees, Nawakai watched. That evening, the fire crackled outside the cabin. Helen had set out bread and soup without invitation. Nawakai joined her, hands clean, demeanor calm. "You should hate me," she said softly. "I was raised to fear men like you." He looked at her for a long moment. "And I was taught white women bring sorrow." They sat in silence, the stars blinking to life. "But here we are," she whispered. He nodded. "Here we are." They said no more that night. But when he rose to leave, he looked back. And Helen knew this man would not leave tomorrow, and neither would her heart. The nights grew warmer, but Helen still lit the fire each evening. Not out of need, but for comfort. It was strange how quickly she'd grown used to the glow of it, and the soft hush of Tovey breathing in the next room. Stranger still was how she'd grown used to the quiet presence of Nawakai. He no longer waited at a distance. He came without asking, sitting on the porch rail, or crouching by her garden to speak with Tovey in soft Comanche words. Sometimes he brought herbs, or fresh berries, or meat his men had hunted, but he never offered them as charity, only as part of something mutual. "Trade," he would say with a small smile, "for more of your soup." One afternoon, Tovey tugged at Helen's sleeve, excited. He motioned for her to come outside, then led her to the back of the cabin where a small circle of stones had been placed. In the center, a new plant had been carefully set in the soil, green, young, but already rooted. Nawakai stepped out from the woods, a small spade in hand. "It is sweetgrass," he said simply. "My mother planted it by every home she loved." Helen's breath caught. "You planted it here." He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The boundaries between them faded day by day. Not erased, but softened, like the lines on a well-used map. Helen began to understand more of his language. Nawakai spoke more English than he let on, and when he used it, he chose his words with care. Not out of caution, out of respect. One evening, as the wind picked up and the lanterns flickered, she asked him what Tovi's name meant again. He turned to her slowly. "Springflower." She smiled. "Fitting. He's the first color I've seen in years." Nawakai watched her face. "And you are the woman who gave him light again." Helen looked down, then back up at him. "And what about you?" He said nothing. But when he reached for her hand, rough against her fingers, yet so steady, she did not pull away. Later that night, she stood by the cradle where Tovi slept, brushing his hair back with gentle fingers. Nawakai stood behind her, not speaking. She turned and whispered, "I don't know what this is becoming." He looked at her, eyes deep as riverstone. "Something we do not need to name to know it is real." She didn't answer with words. She stepped forward, and for the first time he leaned down and kissed her. Not out of desire, not from longing, but because in that moment, there was no other language between them strong enough to carry what they had built. Outside, the fire in the hearth burned low, but in their hearts, something had caught flame. Not wild, not consuming, just steady. A fire that did not burn, but stayed. The next morning brought more than dawn. It brought dust, a rising trail across the southern hills, faint but certain. Helen noticed it first as she was drawing water from the well. By midday, the riders appeared. 4 men from Ash Hollow, the nearest town, rifles strapped to their backs, their eyes squinting hard under worn hats. They stopped at the edge of her fence, surprised to find not only her, but a Comanche man calmly tending her garden, and a child asleep on the porch under a wool blanket. One of them, Henry Mott, a shopkeeper's cousin with a loud mouth and nervous fingers, spoke first. "You all right, Mrs. Ayers?" Helen stood still. "I am." Henry eyed Nawakai, whose stance never changed, his expression unreadable. "He troubling you?" She stepped forward. "No, he's my guest, and his son is recovering under my care." Henry's eyes narrowed. "You sure about that? Because a few folks in town are saying there's a camp of them just over the ridge." "There is? And you're fine with that?" "I'm not fine with suspicion," Helen said, voice calm but iron solid. "I'm fine with truth." Another man, older, grizzled, Mr. Lannery, who once lent her seed for her first garden, raised a hand toward Henry. "She's alive, the boy's safe, we leave it there." But Henry didn't back off. "You think they won't bring others? You think one woman and a kid stop war when it wants to come knocking?" Nawakai finally spoke, his voice low, measured. "I do not want war, but I do not fear it." Henry shifted, his hand moving toward the butt of his rifle. Helen's voice cut through the air. "That boy inside, he nearly died in a trap likely meant for wolves or men. And if you want to talk about fear, Henry, maybe ask yourself what scares you more, a Comanche warrior or a woman who won't bow her head when you ride up with a gun." Silence. The dust settled. No shot was fired. And slowly the men turned their horses back toward town. Uneasy, but leaving. That night, as the sun bled into the earth and coyotes howled from far off, Nawakai sat beside the fire, sharpening an arrowhead. "You risked much today," he said without looking at her. Helen was quiet for a while, then, "So did you. But we both learned how to survive storms." He nodded. "You speak like land that has never been owned." She looked at him, soft smile forming. "That's because I'm done being claimed. But I can choose where I plant roots." His gaze held hers. "And would you plant them here?" She didn't answer. She stood, walked over, and sat beside him, closer than before. Tovi stirred in his sleep inside. The night whispered through the grass. And there, under stars neither of them named, she leaned into the man she once feared and whispered back, "I already have." The following days brought a strange peace. Quiet, but not without weight. Tovi was healing well. The wound on his shoulder had closed into a long, dark scar, and the brightness had returned to his eyes. He ran through the trees in the early mornings and sat in Helen's lap at dusk, humming strange little tunes that sounded part lullaby, part memory. Helen and Nawakai moved around each other like two parts of the same wind, no longer strangers, not yet lovers in the way the world expected, but something unspoken and solid. The way he brought her cedar wood when the nights cooled, the way she left extra bread where she knew he would find it. They didn't explain these things. They simply did them. But beneath that peace, there was tension growing elsewhere. News had reached town. Rumors twisted by fear. She's hiding them. There's more in the woods than she says. Next, it'll be arrows through our windows. Helen didn't hear the words firsthand, but she saw it in the way riders passed the ridge and paused longer. She saw it in the hawk-eyed stares at the trading post when she went to collect salt and cloth. Even Mrs. Elkins, who once brought her preserves in spring, now offered only a thin smile and said, "Some things are better left separate, dear." That night, Helen stood on the porch watching the sky turn violet. Nawakai joined her, his expression more guarded than usual. "There is talk," he said. "My scouts hear it." She nodded. "I know. If the men return," he said slowly, "and bring more than words, we may not have time to talk them down." Helen folded her arms across her chest. "You planning to leave?" "I was. But?" He turned toward her. "But I have already given the boy back his voice. And you have given me something else. A reason to stay still." She swallowed. "If you go, I'll understand, but I won't ask you to." "I know." The wind stirred. Then quietly he added, "And if I stay, it is not just for the boy." Helen looked at him, and before either of them spoke again, Tovi opened the door, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Fire's gone," he murmured, pointing toward the hearth. She smiled and turned back into the cabin to tend it. Nawakai followed. Inside, the fire bloomed again. And so did something else. A choice not yet spoken. A family not yet declared. A storm not yet arrived, but close. The floor beneath them creaked with age and time, but still held firm. And as Tovi climbed into Helen's lap and Nawakai rested beside them with one knee on the worn rug, Helen knew. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The sun rose pale and hazy the next morning, casting long shadows over the hills, as if warning of something unseen. Helen felt it in her bones before she heard the hooves, a pulse in the ground, deeper than any rider alone could make. She stepped onto the porch just as the first dust trail appeared on the horizon. By the time the riders crested the ridge, there were 7 of them, led again by Henry Mott, but this time accompanied by men Helen didn't know. Younger, harder-eyed. Their rifles weren't just for show anymore. Nawakai stepped beside her, silent. Tovi peered out through the cabin window, his breath fogging the glass. Henry didn't wait for pleasantries. "We warned you, Mrs. Ayers," he said. "You didn't listen." "I listened," she replied calmly. "I just didn't obey." The man beside Henry, a lean, sunburned stranger with a deputy's badge crooked on his vest, spat into the dirt. "We're here to remove the threat." Helen didn't blink. "The threat? You mean a boy who almost died in your trap? Or the man who saved his life twice over?" The deputy sneered. "He's Comanche, that's all I need to know." Nawakai's voice was low and even. "Then you are already deaf." Tension snapped in the air like a tight wire. One of the younger men shifted in his saddle, his finger twitching near the trigger. Helen took a slow step forward. "You know my husband's name was carved into this land long before yours ever reached it, Henry Mott. You call yourselves protectors, but you've never once come to help harvest or deliver water in drought. You only show up when you're afraid." Henry's mouth opened, but nothing came. She pointed toward Nawakai. "He's done more for me and for that child than any of you ever have. And if you think you can take that away with threats, then you've never known the kind of strength it takes to raise something from ruin." Silence. Then hooves behind the cabin. Nawakai turned first. From the woods, emerging in 2s and 3s, his warriors stepped forward, not with weapons raised, but with calm, composed readiness. No war cries, no show of violence. Just presence. Enough to make the rifles lower. Enough to make Henry's face go pale. The deputy swallowed. "So this is an ambush?" "No," Helen said firmly. "This is protection, and I didn't ask for it, but I accept it." Henry pulled his horse around, rage on his lips but no action in his hands. "You'll regret this," he hissed. Helen stepped to the edge of the porch. "I already regretted letting fear keep me small. I won't make that mistake again." They left in a cloud of dust and muttered curses, and when they were gone, Helen turned to Nawakai. He said nothing. But in the lines of his face she saw what he hadn't spoken yet. Pride, respect, and something that was beginning to feel dangerously close to devotion. That night, after Tovi had fallen asleep beside the fire with a carved horse in his hands, Helen and Nawakai stood in the doorway, side by side. "They will come again," he said. She nodded. "Then so will we." He looked at her. "You are not afraid?" "Oh, I am," she said. "But love isn't the absence of fear. It's standing in front of it anyway." He reached out, gently brushing a curl behind her ear, and she leaned into his palm. Outside, the night carried the scent of wood smoke and iron. Inside, the quiet was no longer empty. It was the sound of two people choosing not just survival, but each other. The days that followed passed without gunfire, without riders, but not without watching. Helen could feel it in the wind, the eyes on the ridge, the slow, careful silence from town. It wasn't over. Not yet. But for now there was breathing room, and in that space, something deeper began to take shape. One morning, as Helen pulled weeds from the garden, she heard soft footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting Tovi, but it was Nawakai. He held something wrapped in leather, worn but carefully folded. When he crouched beside her, she saw what was inside. A necklace, handmade from polished shell and bone with a single carved pendant shaped like a tree. "I made this," he said quietly, "before the fever took her, my wife. It was meant to mark the beginning of our life together." Helen froze. "You kept it?" He nodded. "Not because I could not move on, but because I would only give it to someone who understood what it means." She swallowed hard. "And what does it mean?" "That I will not run if trouble comes. That I will not let fear take from me again. That I have chosen you." She didn't answer with words. She placed her hand over his, and together they closed the leather back around the necklace, not yet worn, but not refused. A promise laid gently, not with vows, not with rings, but with understanding. That afternoon, she found Tovi by the river, humming to himself while floating a twig boat. He looked up and said without hesitation, "Will he stay now?" Helen knelt beside him. "What do you think?" Tovi considered. "He is not like wind. He is like stone. He will not go unless pushed." Helen smiled. "Then let's not give him a reason to go." That evening, they shared a meal of cornbread, beans, and roasted quail that Nawakai had hunted with his men. The warriors kept their distance, but some nodded to Helen now when they passed. Respect was blooming, slow as spring. After supper, the three of them sat on the porch. Tovi rested with his head in Helen's lap, blinking slowly beneath the last blush of sunlight. "Will we always live here?" he asked sleepily. Helen smoothed his hair. "Would you like that?" "Yes, but maybe a bigger house. One with 2 beds and 1 big chair." Nawakai chuckled, and Helen laughed softly. "Well," she said, glancing at the man beside her, "I think we're building more than just a house." He met her eyes. "We're building a life." Later, when the stars were bright and the fire low, Nawakai stepped out to the edge of the porch, gazing toward the forest. Helen joined him. "Do you miss your people?" He thought for a moment. "I do not miss what was, but I carry them with me. Always." She nodded. "I carry mine too, in different ways." Then she looked at him, serious now. "I don't know what comes next. I can't promise safety, or quiet, or peace." "I do not ask you for peace," he said softly. "I ask you for truth, and your hand when it matters." She reached for him, placed her hand in his, and said, "Then you have it." Under a sky wide enough to hold all their ghosts, 2 people stood together, not bound by past, not yet wed by law, but tied by trust and by the kind of love that rises slow, like firelight at dawn. Spring gave way to summer, and the days grew long, warm, and green. The prairie grasses waved like slow rivers, and wildflowers bloomed near the creek where Tovi now ran barefoot and laughing. The cabin changed too. A second chair appeared on the porch, crafted by Nawakai, the arms smoothed by his hands. A patch of new herbs took root outside the window. Helen added curtains sewn from linen she traded in town, and for the first time in years, she sang softly while sweeping her floor. Their lives had folded together quietly, without ceremony. But love had its own language, and theirs spoke through actions, not declarations. Then came the night the dog didn't bark. Helen woke to silence so complete it felt unnatural. The crickets were gone, the wind still. And then, a creak, the unmistakable shift of wood under weight. She rose from the bed, heart thudding, and moved toward the door just as glass shattered in the kitchen window. "Tovi!" she cried, but Nawakai was already up, bow in hand, his body a blur as he moved toward the sound. Helen swept the boy into her arms and crouched behind the hearth. Outside, voices, at least 3. One called her name. "Mrs. Ayers, just talk, that's all." Another hissed, "Take the man out, get the boy, we'll handle her last." Helen clutched Tovi tighter, and the child didn't cry. He just gripped her shirt and buried his face in her neck. Then came a thud, sharp and final, a scream, a crack of wood, and silence. A moment later, the door opened. Nawakai stepped inside, breathing hard, bow still in hand. A line of blood traced his cheek, but it was not his. "They are gone," he said. Helen stared at him, eyes wide. "All of them?" He nodded. "One ran, the others will not return." She lowered Tovi slowly, then crossed the room to him. "You could have been killed," she said, her voice shaking. "So could you," he replied. But neither of them spoke the next thought aloud. So could he. They sat on the porch until morning, watching the horizon for more riders. None came. Tovi slept curled in Nawakai's arms, Helen beside them, shotgun across her knees. And when the sun finally rose, bathing the cabin in light, Helen whispered, "They didn't come for land or cattle. They came for the space we built between us." Nawakai looked at her, steady and certain, and they failed. Later that day, as the warriors returned from hunting, they found the cabin marked, not with blood, but with fresh lines drawn in the soil. Nawakai's men had made a circle around the property, scattered with sage and sacred herbs, a sign of protection, a sign of claiming, not in possession but in loyalty. Helen stood beside Nawakai as they watched it being completed. "We're a family now," she said quietly. He looked at her hand, then her heart, and said simply, "We always were." The summer sun baked the earth, but inside the cabin it was cool, shaded by thick wood and quiet love. Tovi now spent his mornings splashing in the shallows of the creek, his laughter echoing off the trees like a song. Helen had stitched him new clothes, simple, loose-fitting cotton with embroidered bands, her own blend of frontier and Comanche craft. Nawakai had taken to building things. Not just chairs and fences now, but plans. He'd marked out where a second room might go, how they could expand the porch, where he might craft a smokehouse for meat curing when winter came again. They spoke of these things together like it was natural, like they had always been speaking them. And in truth they had, just without words. One evening, as the sky turned purple behind the cottonwoods, Tovi knelt in the dirt and drew a picture with a stick. Two figures holding hands, a smaller one between them. Helen leaned over, smiling. "Is that us?" Tovi nodded seriously, then pointed at the figure on the left. "Mama." Helen stilled. She hadn't told him to call her that. Never once had she asked. Her eyes turned to Nawakai, who stood nearby splitting wood. He met her gaze, and something deep passed between them. Not surprise, but confirmation. Later that night, when Tovi was asleep and the moonlight filtered across the wooden floor, Helen sat beside Nawakai by the fire. "He called me Mama," she whispered. He nodded. "He has called you that in his dreams for many weeks." Helen's voice was soft. "And what am I to you?" He didn't answer at first. Then, reaching into the pouch at his belt, he pulled out the necklace, the one made long ago for a woman lost. He placed it gently into her hands. "I made this for a life I never got to live," he said. "Now, I offer it for the one I do not want to live without." Helen's eyes filled, not with surprise, but with the weight of knowing. She closed her hand around the necklace. "Then I will wear it, not to bind myself, but to honor what we've built." The next morning, the town's preacher arrived unexpectedly, not with suspicion, but with cautious curiosity. Word of the attack, and Nawakai's restraint, had spread. And so had stories of what kind of woman Helen Ayres had become. He found her in the garden. Nawakai was nearby, sanding a window frame. The preacher tipped his hat. "Ma'am, I've come not to judge, but to ask. Do you need this union recognized?" Helen stood. "Do you?" He blinked. "I suppose not, but the law." "I didn't ask the law to protect him," she said gently. "I asked love." The preacher looked down, then nodded. "Then I'd be honored to speak the words, if that's your will." She glanced toward Nawakai, who had said nothing, and he simply nodded. That Sunday, with no fanfare, no crowd, and no white dress, Helen and Nawakai stood beneath the tree Tovi liked best. The preacher read a few lines from scripture. Nawakai spoke a few words in Comanche. Helen spoke none at all. She only reached for his hand, and that was enough. Inside the cabin, the cradle still sat in the corner, empty for now, but near it sat a second blanket, a second hope, because love, once chosen in silence, now spoke clearly in every room of that home. The heat broke one night with a thunderclap so loud it rattled the porch posts. Rain followed, heavy, cleansing, steady, as the beating of a long-awaited drum. It soaked the dry earth, filled the creek, and washed the dust from every leaf on the property. Helen stood barefoot in the downpour, arms open, laughing like someone reborn. Tovi danced beside her, twirling in circles, his hands catching raindrops like treasure. Nawakai watched from the porch for a long moment, then stepped down into the storm, walking straight toward her. She turned to face him, soaked through, her hair clinging to her cheeks, her eyes bright. "You're not afraid of a little rain, are you?" she asked with a grin. "I have walked through worse," he said. Then he kissed her, there, in the center of the downpour. Not rushed, not shy. A kiss not of beginning, but of arrival. Later that night, as thunder rolled off toward the mountains, Helen sat by the fire brushing Tovi's hair. while Nawakai carved a new wooden figure. A buffalo this time, its legs tucked, its eyes solemn. "You think the rain will bring more than just green?" she asked. He nodded. "Rain always brings something." She looked down at her hands. "I haven't bled in 2 moons. His knife paused. She glanced up at him. "I didn't want to say until I was sure." He said nothing for a long moment. Then he set the carving down, stood, and knelt before her, not in ceremony but in reverence. He placed a hand gently on her stomach and bowed his head. "I lost once," he whispered. "I thought I would never carry again." Helen rested her hand over his. "Now you will carry too." That summer was gentler after the rain. Tovi became bolder, braver, climbing trees, chasing rabbits, and helping Nawakai in the workshop. He carved his first figure, a crooked little bear with one leg shorter than the others, and gave it to Helen with great ceremony. "For the new one," he said proudly. Helen held it like it was gold. They didn't know yet if it would be a boy or girl. It didn't matter. The baby already had a name in Tovi's drawings. Little Star. One evening, as fireflies blinked along the path to the creek, Nawakai placed his hand on Helen's growing belly and said, "Our children will carry 2 languages, 2 lands, 2 names." She nodded. "But 1 heart." He looked at her and his voice lowered. "One that knows love does not ask permission. It simply chooses." Helen leaned into him. And we chose. Outside, the prairie was green again. Inside, their world had never been fuller. Not just a house now, not just survival, but a home, a future, and a family whose love began the day a wounded boy whispered 1 word in a language she didn't know. And she answered with everything she had. By early autumn, the cabin felt full in every way. Not crowded, but complete. Tovi had grown taller and surer of his steps, often found wandering the edge of the woods with a wooden spear Nawakai had carved for him. He'd begun calling the cabin home in both languages, Wara and Comanche, home in English, sometimes blending them together like a song only he could sing. Inside, Helen moved slower now, her belly rounded beneath her cotton dress, and she walked with one hand at her side and the other often resting protectively where life stirred inside her. But she smiled more often, too, laughed more easily. The lines at the corners of her eyes softened with joy. The days had become a rhythm. Morning bread and tea, Tovi's giggles from the creek, the tap-tap-tap of Nawakai's tools shaping wood into cradle rails and corner posts. And in the evenings, long silences filled with presence, not absence. One morning, Helen stood on the porch and looked out over the prairie. Fields of golden grass waved in the wind, and a hawk traced slow circles above. She felt the baby shift inside her, a quiet flutter that made her smile. Nawakai stepped beside her, setting down a basket of kindling. He watched her in silence for a while, then said, "In my people's stories, when a hawk flies over your home, it means something inside is strong enough to protect the land." Helen looked at him. "Then we are strong." He placed a hand on her back. "We are." That afternoon a letter arrived from town, delivered by a young girl with shy eyes and bare feet. She handed it to Helen without a word and hurried off down the trail. Inside the envelope was parchment, folded neat and written in her sister's familiar hand. "We heard rumors that you've taken up with a Comanche man, that there's a child in your house that doesn't bear your name. Is it true, Helen?" Helen read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it slowly, walked to the hearth, and dropped it into the fire. She watched it curl and blacken, her past, her family's doubts, their need for explanation, and let it burn. That night she told Nawakai. He didn't ask her why she burned it. He only said, "The world does not need to name what already lives in the heart." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You always know what to say." He smiled. "That is because you already say the rest." Later, as Tovi fell asleep with his bear tucked under his chin and the fire flickered low, Helen looked around the cabin. She saw shelves filled with carved animals, drying herbs hanging near the window, a pair of boots too small for anyone but a growing boy, and a cradle waiting by the bed. And she whispered almost to herself, "Everything I need is in this room." Nawakai heard her. "And what the world cannot understand, we will not ask it to." Outside, the wind rustled the grass like a lullaby. Inside, a family grew quietly, bravely, beautifully. The first frost came early. The fields turned silver overnight, and the ground stiffened beneath Helen's boots as she stepped out to gather water. Her back ached more now, each step slower, heavier, but she didn't mind. She was nearing her time. The baby had begun to press low, a gentle weight that made her hold the railing as she stepped onto the porch, one hand always resting over the soft rise of her belly. Nawakai noticed everything. He added straw to the floorboards, strengthened the roof against wind, moved the cradle closer to the hearth. When she pretended she wasn't tired, he'd simply wrap her in a blanket and guide her to the rocking chair. No words needed. Tovey, wide-eyed and curious, asked 100 questions about where babies came from. Helen answered only a few.
"The same place all good things come from," she told him once. "Somewhere inside love."
But comfort has its enemies. One morning, as Nawakai chopped wood near the trees, 3 riders appeared again. Not like the last time, with guns and shouts, but with quiet, clipped words and letters bearing seals. They didn't speak to him. They asked for Mrs. Ayres. Helen stepped outside, belly full and heartbeat steady. Tovey clutched the edge of her skirt. The man in the front wore polished boots and gloves, too clean for frontier life. "Ma'am," he said with a slight bow, "we've received reports that you are housing individuals considered outside of legal protection." Helen didn't answer. "We're here to investigate and document." Behind him, a younger man raised a small notebook and pen. "I don't know what you've been told," Helen said, "but this land is mine, the cabin is mine, and every soul inside it is here by my choosing." The man in gloves adjusted his collar. "That's not in dispute. The question is whether you understand the risks. You've become a figure of attention." She blinked. "A figure of what?" "Some call it progress. Others call it betrayal." Helen's breath caught. "Because I chose not to be afraid?" "Because you chose not to be silent." They didn't stay long. They left behind a slip of paper marked "Observed Citizen," with her name and the location of her home. No charges, no threats. Just a reminder that someone somewhere was watching. That night, she handed the paper to Nawakai. He read it slowly, then placed it into the fire. "I have lived my life as a shadow," he said quietly. "Now it seems I must learn to live as a flame." Helen took his hand, then let them see the fire. They didn't talk about moving. They talked about building a smokehouse, a new fence, a larger table, a place where neighbors, not enemies, might one day sit. The baby kicked that night, hard enough to make her gasp. Nawakai placed his hand over her belly and smiled. "She is ready." Helen smiled too. "So are we." Outside, frost covered the windows. Inside, light danced on the walls. And though the world beyond might not understand them, it would never again define them again. Because they were no longer simply surviving. They were rising. The first snow came without warning, blanketing the hills in silence, as if nature itself were holding its breath. The cabin stood warm against the white world, smoke curling from the chimney, the hearth burning steady. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Helen gripped the table's edge, her breath shallow, her eyes focused on nothing and everything all at once. "It's time," she whispered. Nawakai was already moving. Calm, steady. He had prepared for this. Tovey stood near the door, wide-eyed and silent until Nawakai knelt beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Go to the creek," Nawakai said softly. "Bring back clean water. You remember the pail?" Tovey nodded, ran to fetch it, then hesitated. "Is she going to hurt?" Nawakai looked him in the eye. "Yes, but from that pain a gift will come." As the storm outside grew heavier, inside the cabin, Helen labored. Her face was pale, damp with sweat, her hands gripping the wool blanket stretched beneath her. Nawakai knelt at her side, whispering words in Comanche, cooling her forehead with water, helping her breathe through every wave of pain. Hours passed. And then, a cry, sharp, fierce, the kind of sound that broke the stillness of the world and remade it in one breath. A child was born into hands that had once held only sorrow. Now they held a daughter. Helen wept, not from pain, but from the weight of relief and the magnitude of joy. Nawakai wrapped the tiny girl in the same quilt Helen had stitched during long summer evenings. Tovey stepped into the room, wet from snow, his cheeks flushed. Helen beckoned him close. "Come meet your sister." He knelt beside her, wide-eyed, and whispered, "She's small." "She'll grow," Nawakai said. "Like me?" Tovey asked. "Maybe stronger," Helen answered, smiling through her tears. They named her Ahioka, a Comanche word meaning she brought happiness. No lawman, no threat, no history could touch the power of that name. That night, while the snow kept falling, Nawakai sat beside the fire, Ahioka asleep on his chest, Helen curled close at his side. "You've given me 2 lives," he said softly. "One to protect, and one to live." Helen closed her eyes. "And you've given me a place where I don't have to explain who I am, where I'm not wrong for loving out loud." He kissed her temple. "You were never wrong." Outside, the land slept beneath its white blanket. Inside, the future had already begun breathing. And in that little cabin, where once there had only been grief, now there was laughter, light, and a love that no storm could bury. Winter settled deep across Ash Hollow. Drifts piled up at the cabin's baseboards, and icicles hung like crystal teeth from the eaves. But inside, There was warmth, not just from the fire, but from the rhythm of new life. Ahioka slept in her cradle, wrapped in buffalo hide and the softest quilt Helen had ever made. Her breathing was slow and strong. When she cried, it was with purpose. When she smiled in her sleep, it stole the air from Helen's lungs. Tovi became her fiercest protector. He watched her like a scout on duty, peeking into the cradle every morning and whispering stories about clouds, deer, and the time Mama yelled at 3 men with guns and didn't blink once. Nawakai laughed the first time he heard that. "She learns from fire," he said, nodding toward Helen. "She learns from peace," Helen replied, nodding toward him. The town kept its distance during the cold months. No riders came, no letters arrived, and while that silence may have once felt like exile, now it felt like freedom. They used the time to build. A second room was framed by January's end. Nawakai worked by lamplight some nights, and Helen stitched while the baby slept. They shared coffee in the morning and bread with honey in the evening. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't need to. It was the kind of quiet that comes only from trust. One morning, as the snow began to melt into spring's first breath, a figure appeared at the edge of the woods, tall, cloaked, cautious. Helen opened the door with Ahioka in her arms. Nawakai stood beside her. It was Mrs. Elkins. She looked older, thinner, but her eyes held something unexpected. Regret, maybe, or respect. "I heard," she said softly, "that the baby came safely." Helen nodded. "She did." Mrs. Elkins stepped closer. "I brought this." She handed over a tiny bundle, a knitted bonnet, white and soft. "It was my granddaughter's," she added. "She didn't live past her first frost. Maybe yours will wear it through spring." Helen's throat tightened. "Thank you." The woman looked at Nawakai, nodded once, and turned back toward the trees. No more words, just a gesture. A door left open. That night, Helen held the bonnet and whispered to her daughter, "One day they'll say you were born in a cabin that stood between 2 worlds, and built a third one." Nawakai listened from the rocking chair, Tovi asleep in his lap. He whispered back, "One that no one could burn down, because it grew from the inside out." Outside, the snow melted into earth. Inside, love grew deeper roots. Not the kind written into laws. Not the kind stamped by seal or paper, but the kind that doesn't melt when the world watches, only when it's ready to bloom. By the time the creek ran fast again and the trees began to bud, the cabin no longer looked like a widow's shelter on the edge of nothing. It looked like a home that had stood for generations. The second room was finished, its window opening east toward the sunrise. Helen painted the sill blue, so the morning would always know where to land. Nawakai built a small carved sign above the door in both Comanche and English. It simply read, "We belong." In the evenings they gathered outside, the 5 of them now, Helen, Nawakai, Tovi, Ahioka, and the life they had chosen together. Nawakai would smoke his pipe while rocking little Ahioka in his arms, and Helen would lean against the porch post, watching the horizon as if daring it to challenge what they had built. Sometimes neighbors passed by on distant trails. They didn't stop, but they no longer stared. One day, a wagon came from town. It carried books, flour, seeds, and something wrapped in brown paper. A small printed notice from the mayor's office. "To Mrs. Ayers and Mr. Nawakai, Ash Hollow recognizes your family's permanent residence on the Eastern Ridge. You are recorded as citizens, with land rights intact. All grievances have been dismissed. May your land flourish." Helen read the letter 3 times, then handed it to Tovi. "What does this mean?" he asked. "It means no one can take what we've made. Even if they try?" She smiled. "They already did and failed." That night, as the stars lit the field behind the house, Nawakai took Helen's hand and led her down to the cottonwood tree by the creek, the one where he had first offered her his silence, then his truth, then his love. "I carved something," he said. On the trunk, hidden in the grooves and shaded by branches, were the initials, H+N+T+A, and beneath it, one word carved in both their languages. "Home." Helen traced the word with her fingers. "I didn't know it could mean more than one place," she whispered. Nawakai touched her chin gently. "It doesn't. It only ever meant one place. You." They stood there for a long time, 2 hearts shaped by fire and distance, by sorrow and choice, holding each other beneath the tree that now held their story too. Ahioka slept soundly in her mother's arms. Tovi ran barefoot through the grass, his laughter echoing into the wind. And in the stillness between them, the world turned quietly in their favor, not loudly, not all at once, but surely. Like spring always does, the seasons turned again. By late summer, the fields around the cabin had bloomed wild with tall grass and sunflowers. Bees hummed, the air smelled of mint and pine sap, and the river behind the cottonwood had carved a new curve into the earth, just enough to remind them that even the land shifted quietly with time. Tovey now ran with a bow across his shoulder and stories in his mouth. He told visitors when they came that he had two mothers, one who gave him life and one who taught him to live. Helen never corrected him. Ahyoka was learning to walk, wobbling barefoot on the porch planks with her hands outstretched and her eyes wide with mischief. She'd fall, then giggle and try again. "She's stubborn," Helen would say. "She is ours," Noakai would reply. That autumn, the town held a gathering, the first real one since the hard years. Word spread of a harvest feast, music, and trade. At first Helen said nothing. She'd grown used to their quiet life. She didn't need the town's approval. But one evening, as she watched Tovey help Noakai polish a carved toy for Ahyoka, she asked, "Would you go if I wanted to?" Noakai looked up from his work. "If you go, I go." So they went. The town square was lined with lanterns and laughter. People paused when they saw the family arrive together. Helen in her green shawl, Ahyoka bundled at her chest, Noakai at her side, and Tovey walking between them like he belonged to both worlds. Because he did. Mrs. Elkins was the first to approach. She handed Helen a jar of fig preserves. "For the winter," she said. "And because I owe you more than quiet." Helen smiled. "Your kindness says more than your silence ever did." The mayor approached next. "Glad to see you, Mrs. Ayres, Mr. Noakai." Noakai nodded. "We are glad to be seen." No more whispers, no more veiled glances, just people adjusting their gaze. That night, Noakai and Helen stood under the lanterns while a slow tune played on a fiddle. Tovey had run off to join the other children. Ahyoka slept pressed to Helen's chest. Noakai extended his hand. "I am not good at this," he said. She smiled, placing her fingers in his. "Then we'll be terrible together." They swayed in a slow, quiet circle while townsfolk watched from porches and hay bales. And in that moment, no one saw a Comanche man and a frontier widow. They saw what they truly were. A family, chosen, forged, unshakable. Back at the cabin that night, as the fire dimmed and Tovey snored softly in the loft, Helen leaned her head on Noakai's shoulder. "I didn't think this kind of life was for people like me," she whispered. He turned to her. "It wasn't given to us," he said. "We built it." Outside, the river curved gently toward the trees. Inside, two souls rested in the home they'd shaped from ruin, brick by brick, breath by breath, and love that bent, but never broke. The first frost arrived gently, like someone whispering over the land. The porch creaked beneath light snow. Smoke curled from the chimney. Ahyoka pressed her tiny hands to the frosted window, her breath leaving warm fog where she squealed at birds in the trees. Tovey carved arrows beside the hearth, determined to impress Noakai, who had finally agreed to teach him to hunt come spring. Helen looked up from her sewing and watched them all. It didn't escape her how much had changed. Not just outside, the town, the trails, the way neighbors waved now without hesitation, but inside her. Inside this home that had once held only silence and ghosts. Now it pulsed with warmth, with names, with belonging. One morning a letter arrived, folded in parchment, tied with twine. Tovey handed it over, his eyes full of curiosity. "It's from Missouri," he said, pointing to the seal. "Where you came from." Helen opened it with care. "Helen, I don't know if this letter will find you. I only just heard about Jacob's passing. Word travels slow out here. If you're still alive, and if you're still Helen Ayres, I want you to know that what you did took more strength than most of us ever learned to show. You were right to leave. I was wrong not to follow. Your sister misses you. I do too. If you ever find yourself headed east again, there's a place at my table and room in my heart. Love, Eleanor." Helen folded the letter and stared at the flames. She didn't cry. Not like she once did. Instead, she smiled a little. "Will we go?" Noakai asked gently, sensing her mood. Helen shook her head. "No, not yet." He waited. Then she added, "But maybe someday, so they can meet you, so they can meet us." In the following weeks, Helen began writing back. Letters filled with stories of how a boy wandered into her woods, of how a father came with warriors but left his weapons at the edge of her porch, of how a life she never imagined became the only one she'd ever want. The holidays came. They cut a pine from the back grove. Tovey decorated it with feathers and carved stars. Ahyoka pulled them down just as fast. Helen baked bread and listened to Noakai sing softly in Comanche, songs old as rivers, stories older than stone. And as the cabin filled with the scent of cedar, bread, and laughter, Helen understood something deep and quiet. She had not been rescued. She had not been taken in. She had chosen. And in that choice, she had built something the world could never undo. Outside, winter wrapped the valley. Inside, love bloomed where silence once lived, and when night fell, it did so gently, like a soft hand on the shoulder, or a promise kept through snow. Years passed the way soft rivers wear down stone, not with fury but with patience. Ash Hollow grew. A new schoolhouse stood beyond the chapel. The general store expanded. People spoke less of divisions, more of seasons and crops, of weddings and names chosen with care. In the heart of this change stood the cabin by the cottonwoods, weathered, strong, and steady. Helen's hair turned silver at the edges. Nawakai's shoulders remained straight, though his eyes had softened with time. Tovi had grown tall, broad-shouldered like the man who raised him, and wise beyond his age. And Ayoka, quick-footed and bright-eyed, had learned to ride, read, and question everything, especially the old stories. "Did you really find Tovi in the woods?" she asked once, arms crossed, skeptical. Helen smiled. "I didn't find him, he found me." One spring morning, Tovi packed a satchel. "I want to see the southern lands," he told them, "the ones Papa Nawakai talks about. I want to find others who speak his tongue." Nawakai didn't argue. He walked with Tovi to the edge of the field and handed him a carved staff. "Take this," he said. "Speak truth. Leave nothing behind but kindness." Helen held him tight. "Right, or I'll come drag you back." "I will," he laughed, "but you won't have to." They watched him walk over the ridge, past the wild poppies, until the trees swallowed him from sight. Back home, Ahyoka helped Helen plant a new tree beside the porch. "Why here?" she asked. Helen looked up at the old cottonwood, now hollowed with age but still standing. "Because one day this will be yours." Ahyoka frowned. "The house?" "No, the story." That autumn, a storm knocked down the sign above the door, the one Nawakai had carved all those years ago. They found it the next morning, split but not shattered. Helen picked it up, brushed the dirt away, and whispered, "We'll make another." But Nawakai shook his head. "No," he said softly. "Let it rest." Instead, he built something else. A stone marker in the earth just beneath the cottonwood. On it were 4 names: Helen, Nawakai, Tovi, Ahyoka. Beneath them, where the river bends, we chose to stay. In the quiet of evening, Helen sat by the fire, Ahyoka asleep nearby. Nawakai poured her tea and touched her hand. "You still miss the silence?" he asked. Helen looked around. The creaking of wood, the gentle breath of sleeping children, the hum of a home built in defiance of sorrow. "No," she whispered. "I don't miss silence anymore. I've learned it speaks. But love speaks louder." Outside, the wind carried seeds. The river curved a little more. And inside, under a roof shaped by hardship and choice, a family stayed warm. Not by fire alone, but by everything they'd built from a single act of kindness that changed the course of many lives. Forever. The morning sun filtered through thin curtains, casting gold across the wooden floor. Helen woke slowly, the scent of pine and ash filling her senses. She listened. Not for danger, not for footsteps, but for the familiar sounds of home. Ahyoka's laughter echoed outside. She was older now, 12, with a mind sharp as a blade and a heart tender as spring rain. She chased the wind in moccasins Nawakai had stitched with care, braids trailing behind her like a banner of joy. Nawakai stood on the porch, sipping coffee, his hair more salt than charcoal. But his presence, like always, felt rooted, safe. She joined him, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. "Any letters?" she asked. He handed her an envelope. It was from Tovi. "Mama, Papa!" "I found them. The Comanche bands Papa spoke of. Not many, but proud. They asked me questions, and I answered in both your names. They taught me more than I expected. About land, about memory, about forgiveness. There's a woman here. Her name is Atenya. I'd like to bring her home. I want her to see where I was raised, by both blood and love. By you. We'll arrive when the snow breaks. With love always, Tovi." Helen read the letter 3 times before looking up. "He's bringing someone home," she said. Nawakai didn't smile broadly. He simply nodded. "As it should be." That winter, preparations began. Ahyoka painted the inside of the cabin, humming her own tune. Helen washed old quilts. Nawakai carved a second table. When spring came, it was the softest they'd known. The earth stirred with promise. A wagon rolled up the dirt path near dawn, and Tovi stepped down, taller, calmer, hand in hand with a woman whose eyes carried stars. Etenia greeted Helen first, not with words, but with an embrace so full it made Helen's knees weaken. "You're already home," Helen whispered. That night they gathered around a large fire. Etenia shared stories in Comanche and broken English. Nawakai translated gently. Ahyoka asked endless questions. Tovey watched it all, the life they'd built, the legacy taking root before his eyes. And for a long moment, no one spoke. Because sometimes love doesn't need to say a thing. Helen leaned against Nawakai as the fire crackled.
You ever think we'd get this far? She whispered.
He looked out at the circle of warmth and new beginnings. I didn't think I'd live long enough to see it, he said. But I'm glad I did.
She squeezed his hand.
You're more than I ever prayed for. He looked into her eyes. You're the answer I never dared ask for. Under the vast sky where stars blinked like old truths, the family sat in silence. Not the kind born of loneliness, but the kind born of peace, of lives salvaged, of wounds healed, of chosen love, the fiercest kind there is. And where the river bent, beneath the old cottonwood, a fire burned long into the night, telling the world, this is where love lives. This is where it stays. Forever.